It was just another busy afternoon at the airport in New York City. The terminal buzzed with activity as travelers scurried around, dragging suitcases behind them and checking their watches nervously. Overhead speakers blared announcements about delayed flights and gate changes, blending into the background noise of rolling luggage wheels and distant chatter. Amid all this chaos sat a man who seemed completely unfazed by the commotion surrounding him. He was an ordinary-looking guy, dark-skinned, somewhere in his early 40s, dressed casually in jeans and a plain sweater. His head was tilted slightly, forward, eyes glued to his phone as he scrolled through emails. He wasn't flashy or loud. If anything, he blended right into the crowd. Most people wouldn't have given him a second glance, but that was about to change. As the man sat quietly minding his own business, a shrill voice cut through the hum of the terminal like a knife. "Excuse me." The words were sharp, demanding attention. Everyone within earshot turned toward the source, a middle-aged woman striding toward the seating area with purpose. Her face was red, her lips pressed tightly together in what could only be described as barely contained anger. The man looked up from his phone, startled but calm, his brow furrowing slightly in confusion. Before he could say anything, the woman pointed directly at the empty seat next to him. "That's my seat," she declared loudly, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "You need to move." Now here's where things got interesting. The seat she was pointing at? It was empty, completely unoccupied. There was no one sitting there except air, and yet the woman stood there glaring at him as though he'd committed some grave crime. The man blinked slowly, trying to process what was happening. Was she talking to him? About that seat? Before he could respond, the woman continued, her voice rising even higher. "I don't know how you think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. Her accusatory glare never left his face. Around them, heads began to turn. A few passengers paused mid-step, curious about the escalating situation. Some pulled out their phones, sensing drama brewing. Others exchanged glances, shaking their heads silently at the spectacle unfolding before them. The man finally found his voice. "Ma'am," he said softly, holding up a hand in a gesture meant to calm her down. "This seat is empty. I'm not sure why," but the woman cut him off before he could finish. "Don't play dumb with me," she interrupted, jabbing a finger in his direction. "You're sitting in first class acting like you belong here." She paused for dramatic effect, letting her accusation hang heavy in the air. Then came the kicker. "People like you shouldn't be taking spaces meant for others." Her choice of words didn't go unnoticed. Several bystanders exchanged uncomfortable looks. One young couple whispered to each other, clearly offended by her tone. Another traveler muttered under their breath, "Wow, this is awkward." Yet, despite the growing tension, the man remained composed. He didn't raise his voice or retaliate. Instead, he simply leaned back slightly, studying her with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "You've got it wrong," he said evenly, keeping his tone polite but firm. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm not in your seat. I haven't taken anyone's seat." But the woman wasn't having it. If anything, his calm demeanor seemed to infuriate her more. "Oh, so now I'm lying?" she shot back, throwing her hands in the air. "Listen, buddy, I've paid good money for this flight and I deserve respect. You can't just sit here looking. She trailed off, searching for the right insult, then settled on something vague but loaded. "Like you don't even belong." By now, a small crowd had gathered around them. People were filming the exchange on their phones, capturing every word. Some were openly siding with the man, whispering comments like, "She's being ridiculous," or "Why is she picking a fight?" Others hung back, unsure whether to step in or let the scene play out naturally. Either way, the atmosphere was tense, charged with the kind of energy that comes when strangers witness something they know isn't quite right. And while the woman ranted and raved, the man stayed silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "If you'd like, we can clear this up with the gate agent," he suggested, gesturing toward the counter nearby. "They'll confirm everything." At this point, the woman hesitated, For a brief second, doubt flickered across her face. Maybe she realized she'd gone too far, or maybe she was starting to wonder if she'd made a mistake, but pride or something else kept her going. Squaring her shoulders, she declared, "Fine, let's call them over. I'm sure they'll agree with me." Little did she know, calling over the gate agent would lead to a revelation neither of them expected, and one that would leave everyone watching speechless. The man's suggestion to involve the gate agent seemed reasonable enough, at least on the surface. But the woman didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down, her voice growing louder and more aggressive with each passing second. "Oh, so, now you're trying to pull rank?" she sneered, planting her hands firmly on her hips. "You think bringing in someone else is going to scare me off? I'm not afraid of you or anyone else." Her tone was dripping with defiance, but there was something else beneath it. Uncertainty. For a split second, her eyes darted around the growing crowd as if searching for support. But no one stepped forward to back her up. Instead, most people stood silently, watching the scene unfold with a mix of fascination and discomfort. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, while others whispered to their companions, clearly siding with the calm man who had done nothing but try to explain himself. "I'm not trying to scare you," the man replied, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. He leaned back slightly in his seat, his posture relaxed but alert. "I'm just suggesting we clear this up quickly so everyone can move on. There's no need to make a big deal out of nothing." But the woman wasn't interested in resolving things peacefully. She took a step closer, looming over him as if trying to intimidate him into submission. "Nothing? You call this nothing?" she spat, her voice rising even higher. "You're sitting here acting like you own the place, like you have some kind of special privilege. Well, let me tell you something. You don't belong here." Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The accusation felt personal, almost like an attack on his very presence. Around them, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A young woman holding a toddler muttered under her breath, "Wow, that's harsh." An older gentleman nearby shook his head and said to his companion, "She's really laying it on thick, isn't she?" Despite the hostility directed at him, the man remained composed. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. Instead, he looked up at her with a calm expression that somehow managed to convey both patience and frustration. "Ma'am," he said, slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I understand you're upset, but accusing me of taking your seat when it's clearly empty isn't fair. If you'd like, I'll happily show you my boarding pass to prove I'm supposed to be here." For a moment, the woman faltered. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue further, but then she clenched her jaw and crossed her arms again. "Fine," she snapped, her tone laced with skepticism. "Let's see it then. Show me your boarding pass and prove you're telling the truth." The man reached into his pocket without hesitation and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it smoothly and held it up for her to see. But instead of calming her down, the sight of the boarding pass only seemed to fuel her anger. She snatched it out of his hand before he could stop her, scrutinizing it closely as if searching for evidence of forgery. "This doesn't mean anything?" she exclaimed after a few seconds, thrusting the paper back at him. "Anyone can fake a boarding pass these days. How do I know you didn't just print this off somewhere?" Now the crowd began to stir. A few people exchanged incredulous looks, while others openly rolled their eyes. One man standing nearby muttered loud enough for those around him to hear, "This is getting ridiculous. Just let him sit in peace already." The man, however, didn't seem fazed by her accusation. He simply tucked the boarding pass back into his pocket and gestured toward the gate counter. "If you're still not convinced, we can ask the gate agent to verify it for us," he suggested, his tone still calm and polite. "They'll confirm that I'm in the right seat." At this point, the woman hesitated again. She glanced toward the gate counter, then back at him, her confidence wavering ever so slightly. But pride, or perhaps embarrassment at having caused such a scene, kept her from backing down. Squaring her shoulders, she declared, "Fine, let's go talk to them. But if they side with you, I'm filing a complaint. This kind of behavior shouldn't be tolerated." With that, she marched off toward the gate counter, leaving the man to follow behind her at a leisurely pace. As they walked, the crowd parted, slightly to let them through. though many continued filming the encounter on their phones. Whispers rippled through the group of onlookers, ranging from sympathy for the man to disbelief at the woman's persistence. When they reached the gate counter, the agent, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked up from her computer screen. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing between the two of them curiously. Before the man could speak, the woman launched into an impassioned explanation of the situation, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This man is claiming he's in the correct seat, but I don't believe him," she said, pointing an accusatory finger in his direction. "He's sitting in first class, and frankly, he doesn't look like he belongs here. I want you to check his boarding pass and confirm whether he's telling the truth." The gate agent raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the woman's bluntness. She turned to the man, who simply handed over his boarding pass without saying a word. As she scanned it, her expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, and then to something resembling awe. "Sir," she began hesitantly, looking between the man and the woman, "are you the founder of this airline?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, there was complete silence. Even the woman froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open in shock. It was as if time itself had stopped. The man nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The revelation sent ripples through the crowd. Gasps erupted, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Phones were raised higher as people scrambled to capture the moment. Someone nearby whispered, "Did you hear that? He owns the whole airline." The woman, meanwhile, looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Her face turned bright red and she stammered, "What? That's impossible. You can't be serious." But the gate agent confirmed it with a nod. "It's true," she said, addressing the woman directly. "This passenger is the owner of the airline. His credentials are valid and he's seated exactly where he's supposed to be." The woman's bravado crumbled instantly. She opened and closed her mouth several times, struggling to find words. Finally, she managed to choke out, "Well, I didn't know that. How was I supposed to know? You're not dressed like... She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. The man simply smiled faintly, letting the absurdity of her comment sink in. And with that, the tide had turned completely. What started as a baseless accusation had transformed into a public spectacle, and one that would soon spiral far beyond the confines of the airport terminal. The silence that followed the gate agent's confirmation was deafening. For a few seconds, no one moved or spoke. The woman stood frozen, her face flushed and her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She looked like someone who had just stepped on stage without realizing the spotlight was on her, caught off guard, exposed, and utterly unprepared for what came next. The man, still calm and composed, didn't gloat or rub it in. Instead, he simply waited, his expression neutral but with a hint of quiet satisfaction playing at the corners of his mouth. Around them, the crowd buzzed with energy. People whispered excitedly to each other, their voices rising as they pieced together the implications of what they'd just heard. "Wait, so this guy owns the airline?" one traveler asked aloud, turning to his companion. Another person nearby chimed in, "That's wild. No wonder she looks like she's about to faint." The gate agent, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over. "Ma'am," she said gently, addressing the woman, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding. This passenger is indeed authorized to be here, and everything checks out perfectly." Her tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for argument. But the woman wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. She straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Well, I mean," she stammered, clearly grasping at straws. "You're not exactly dressed like someone who owns an airline." The words tumbled out awkwardly, landing flat in the charged atmosphere. Even she seemed to realize how weak her comeback sounded, because she immediately clamped her mouth shut, looking around nervously as if hoping someone would agree with her. No one did. Instead, the crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief. A young woman holding a coffee cup muttered loud enough for those around her to hear, "Oh my goodness, she just doesn't know when to stop." An older gentleman shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath. Some people just dig themselves, deeper and deeper. The man finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Ma'am," he said, leaning forward slightly to make eye contact. "I understand you were upset earlier, but let's be honest. This situation has gone far enough. If you'd like, we can put this behind us and move forward." His suggestion seemed reasonable, even generous, but the woman wasn't ready to back down completely. Still flustered, she shot back, "Fine, whatever. But I still think there's something suspicious about all this. Why are you sitting here quietly instead of being up front where everyone can see you?" Her question drew more gasps from the crowd. It was clear she was clutching at anything to justify her behavior, but her accusations were starting to sound desperate and increasingly ridiculous. The man, however, didn't rise to the bait. He simply raised an eyebrow, letting the absurdity of her comment hang in the air for a moment before responding. "I'm sitting here," he said evenly, "because I prefer to keep a low profile. Not everyone wants to announce their presence, wherever they go. Sometimes it's nice to blend in and enjoy some peace and quiet." His response earned nods of approval from the onlookers. Someone called out jokingly, "Sounds like someone needs to take notes." The remark elicited a ripple of laughter from the crowd, further deflating the woman's confidence. Realizing she was losing ground fast, the woman turned to the gate agent again. "Can we just resolve this already?" she demanded, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't want to waste any more time on this nonsense." The gate agent nodded quickly, eager to defuse the situation. "Of course," she replied. "Let me confirm your seat assignment so we can get you settled." She typed a few keys on her computer, then glanced up with a polite smile. "It looks like your assigned seat is actually 2 rows behind this gentleman's. Would you like me to escort you there?" The woman hesitated, clearly torn between indignation and embarrassment. Finally, she huffed loudly and muttered, "Fine, whatever. Let's just get this over with." As the gate agent led her away, the crowd began to disperse, though many continued filming the aftermath. Phones were lowered reluctantly, conversations resumed, and the terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But the damage had already been done for both parties involved. For the woman, the encounter had spiraled wildly out of control. What started as a simple complaint about seating arrangements had morphed into a public spectacle that left her humiliated and defensive. For the man, the incident was less about personal vindication and more about exposing the underlying biases that often drive such confrontations. He hadn't sought attention. In fact, he'd actively avoided it by blending in. Yet here he was, thrust into the spotlight against his will. Once the woman was seated several rows back, visibly sulking and avoiding eye contact with anyone, the man settled back into his original spot. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through emails as if nothing unusual had happened. But the mood around him had shifted entirely. Passengers who had previously ignored him now gave him knowing nods or offered small smiles as they passed by. Some even stopped to thank him for handling the situation with grace. One elderly woman approached him cautiously, clutching her carry-on bag tightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice warm and kind. "I just wanted to say, well, you handled that beautifully. I'm sorry you had to deal with all that." The man looked up and smiled genuinely. "Thank you," he replied. "It's not easy, but sometimes staying calm is the best way to handle these situations." She nodded before walking away, leaving him to his thoughts. As the minutes ticked by, the plane began boarding, and passengers filed onto the aircraft one by one. When it was finally his turn, the flight attendants greeted him warmly, offering him extra assistance, despite his insistence that he didn't need special treatment. Meanwhile, the woman remained seated stiffly in her assigned spot, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Every time a passenger walked past her, she avoided making eye contact as if trying to shrink into invisibility. It was clear she regretted her actions, but also that the lesson had come too late. By the time the plane doors closed and the engines roared to life, the drama of the airport terminal felt like a distant memory. But for everyone on board, the story lingered, a reminder of how quickly assumptions can escalate into conflict, and how humility and patience can sometimes speak louder than anger or pride. As the plane taxied down the runway, the tension between the two passengers, though now separated by rows of seats, still lingered in the air. The woman sat stiffly in her assigned seat, staring out the window but not really seeing anything beyond the glass. Her hands were clasped tightly together on her lap, her knuckles white from gripping them so hard. Every time a flight attendant passed by, she flinched slightly, as if expecting another confrontation or awkward moment. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, clearly wishing she could disappear altogether. Meanwhile, the man settled comfortably into his first-class seat near the front of the plane. He had put on noise-canceling headphones and opened a book, seemingly unfazed by the earlier drama. On the surface, he appeared relaxed, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, an almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't smugness. Rather, it was the look of someone who knew they had the upper hand but chose not to rub it in. Still, he couldn't resist indulging in a little playful mischief. When the flight attendants came around offering drinks, one of them leaned in discreetly and whispered something to him. He nodded politely, then turned to glance briefly over his shoulder toward the economy section where the woman was seated. Without hesitation, he gave the attendant a small nod, signaling for them to proceed. Whatever was said remained unspoken, but the wheels were already in motion. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant approached the woman's row with a tray of complimentary snacks. "Ma'am," the attendant said cheerfully, leaning down slightly to address her directly, "we wanted to ensure you're comfortable during your flight. Would you care for a beverage? Perhaps a glass of champagne?" The woman blinked in surprise, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. No, thank you," she mumbled, still avoiding eye contact. "Water is fine." The attendant smiled brightly, undeterred by her frosty response. "Absolutely. And here's a warm towel for your comfort," she added, placing a neatly folded cloth on the woman's tray table. Then, without missing a beat, she continued, "Also, let us know if you need anything else. We're here to make sure your experience is exceptional." For a moment, the woman looked genuinely confused. Was this some kind of trick? Had the man orchestrated this sudden surge of attention to embarrass her further? Or was it just coincidence? Either way, she didn't know how to respond. So, she simply muttered a quick, "Thank you," and turned back to stare out the window, pretending to ignore the situation entirely. But that was only the beginning. Throughout the flight, the attendants seemed to go out of their way to check on her repeatedly. They brought her extra blankets, refilled her water glass without being asked, and even offered her dessert options when meal service began. Each interaction was polite and professional, yet there was an undeniable undertone of exaggerated enthusiasm. It was clear they were following specific instructions. But whose? Every time the woman glanced nervously toward the front of the cabin, she couldn't help but notice the man sitting calmly in his seat, sipping a cup of coffee and flipping through pages of his book. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the aisle, and while he never said a word, the faintest trace of amusement danced in his expression. That alone was enough to send waves of discomfort rippling through her body. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was part of some elaborate inside joke, one she hadn't been invited to participate in. The intercom announcements didn't help matters either. Every time the captain or crew addressed the passengers, there seemed to be a hidden layer of subtext directed squarely at her. For instance, when the pilot welcomed everyone aboard, he added, "We hope all our guests feel valued and respected during their journey today." Later, during the safety demonstration, the flight attendant emphasized the importance of treating fellow travelers with courtesy and understanding. Even the pre-landing announcement included a reminder about the value of patience and empathy in crowded spaces. To the average passenger, these messages sounded routine, standard phrases meant to foster goodwill among travelers. But to the woman, each word felt like a pointed jab aimed directly at her ego. By the time the plane began its descent, she looked utterly drained, her shoulders slumped and her face pale. She hadn't touched her food, hadn't spoken to anyone, and hadn't once cracked open the magazine tucked into the seatback pocket. In front of her, If anything, the relentless politeness had worn her down more than any outright confrontation ever could. When the plane finally landed and the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. The man stood up casually, slipping his book into his carry-on bag before joining the line forming in the aisle. As he waited, he exchanged brief pleasantries with nearby travelers, many of whom thanked him again for handling the earlier incident with such grace. One businessman shook his hand warmly, saying, "You handled that better than I ever could have. Respect." The woman, meanwhile, lingered in her seat until the last possible moment, hoping to avoid drawing any more attention to herself. When she finally stood up, she moved quickly, keeping her head down and clutching her purse tightly against her chest. She slipped into the crowd heading toward the exit, blending into the sea of passengers streaming off the plane. However, fate, or perhaps karma, had one final twist in store for her. Just as she reached the jet bridge, the lead flight attendant stopped her with a friendly smile. "Ma'am," the attendant said brightly, handing her a small envelope. "This is for you. We hope you enjoyed your flight." The woman hesitated, glancing suspiciously at the envelope before taking it. Inside was a handwritten note along with a voucher for a free upgrade to first class on her next flight. The note read, "Thank you for flying with us. We appreciate your understanding and cooperation. Safe travels." Her face flushed red as she realized what had happened. Whether it was meant as a genuine gesture of goodwill or a clever bit of irony, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that she couldn't wait to step off the plane and leave the whole ordeal behind. As she disappeared into the terminal, dragging her suitcase behind her, the man watched her go with a mixture of amusement and pity. He didn't hold any grudges. Instead, he saw the day's events as a reminder of how quickly pride and prejudice can lead to unnecessary conflict, and how sometimes a little humility goes a long way. Shaking his head lightly, he adjusted the strap of his bag and walked in the opposite direction, ready to move on from the chaos and return to his quiet life. Little did either of them know, however, that the story was far from over. Back on the plane, several passengers had recorded snippets of the earlier confrontation, and those videos were already making their way online. Within hours, millions would see the footage, sparking debates and discussions about privilege, prejudice, and the power of staying calm under pressure. What started as a simple misunderstanding in an airport terminal was about to become a global conversation, one that neither party could have anticipated. By the time the plane touched down and passengers began filing out, the incident between the man and the woman had already started its journey into the digital world. Several travelers who witnessed the confrontation couldn't resist pulling out their phones to capture snippets of the drama. Some recorded video clips during the heated exchange at the gate, while others snapped photos of the man's calm demeanor and the woman's increasingly flustered reactions. These recordings weren't meant for private viewing. They were destined for social media, where stories like this often explode overnight. Within hours of landing, the first post went live. A young college student uploaded a short clip of the argument with the caption, "When you accuse someone of stealing your seat only to find out they own the airline, your karma, your respect." The post quickly gained traction, racking up thousands of likes and shares in no time. Comments poured in from all corners of the internet, ranging from outrage over the woman's behavior to admiration for the man's composure. One user wrote, "This is why we need more chill CEOs in the world," while another quipped, "She really picked the wrong person to mess with, LOL." As the hours passed, more videos surfaced. Passengers who had been on the plane shared additional details about how the flight attendants treated the woman during the journey. Someone posted a photo of the handwritten note and voucher she received upon exiting, sparking even more debate. Was it a kind gesture or a subtle dig? People couldn't agree, but everyone had an opinion. Memes began cropping up too, featuring exaggerated captions like, "Me when I realize I've insulted the boss," alongside images of shocked faces. The story spread like wildfire across platforms: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, you name it. On Twitter, hashtags like "Gurger Racist Karen Exposed" and "Sargent CEO in Disguise" trended globally, drawing millions of views. Influencers hopped on the bandwagon, sharing commentary about privilege, prejudice, and the dangers of jumping to conclusions based on appearances. Meanwhile, Reddit threads dissected every detail of the encounter, with users analyzing body language, tone, and even wardrobe choices, or lack thereof. One particularly viral TikTok featured a reenactment of the scene, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion shots of the woman's face turning red. The creator captioned it, "That moment when karma hits you mid-flight, justice served." It amassed millions of views, becoming one of the platform's top-performing videos that week. Viewers flooded the comments section, debating whether the woman deserved sympathy or ridicule. While some argued that her actions stemmed from ignorance rather than malice, others felt she'd crossed a line by making baseless accusations rooted in bias. As the online frenzy grew, so did the scrutiny of both individuals involved. Curious netizens dug deeper, attempting to uncover identities and backgrounds. Screenshots of the woman's LinkedIn profile circulated widely, revealing that she worked as a regional manager for a retail chain. This discovery added fuel to the fire, as people criticized her job title and questioned how someone in a leadership role could behave so poorly in public. Her employer soon took notice, issuing a statement condemning discriminatory behavior and announcing that she had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. For the woman, the backlash was overwhelming. Her social media accounts, which were previously private, were bombarded with hateful messages and threats. Friends and colleagues reportedly distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone embroiled in such controversy. Strangers showed up at her workplace to protest, holding signs that read "Accountability Matters" and "Check Your Privilege." Local news outlets picked up the story, airing segments about the viral incident and interviewing experts on racism and corporate responsibility. Overnight, she became a symbol of entitlement and prejudice, a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to make snap judgments. On the flip side, the man found himself thrust into the spotlight in ways he hadn't anticipated. Journalists scrambled to learn more about him, praising his calm handling of the situation and highlighting his achievements as an entrepreneur. Business magazines hailed him as a modern-day hero, applauding his decision to remain composed despite being targeted unfairly. Interview requests poured in from major networks, eager to hear his perspective on the ordeal. However, true to his low-key nature, he declined most of them, opting instead to focus on running his airline and promoting inclusivity within the industry. In one rare interview, conducted via email, he reflected on the incident with remarkable grace. "What happened that day wasn't about me. It was about the assumptions people make based on appearances," he wrote. "We live in a world where success doesn't look one way, and it's time we stop judging others before getting to know them." My hope is that this story sparks meaningful conversations about respect, empathy, and understanding. Despite his efforts to stay humble, fans rallied around him, celebrating him as a role model for patience and resilience. Social media users created fan art depicting him as a superhero, complete with a cape labeled "Chill CEO." Others shared personal anecdotes about facing similar biases, thanking him for inspiring them to handle difficult situations with dignity. For many, his quiet strength represented a refreshing contrast to the chaos and hostility that often dominate headlines. Meanwhile, the woman tried desperately to salvage her reputation. She issued a public apology via Twitter, claiming she hadn't intended to offend anyone and that she was merely standing up for herself. "I regret any harm caused by my words," she tweeted. "This has been a learning experience, and I'm committed to doing better moving forward." Predictably, few were convinced. Critics accused her of insincerity, pointing out that her statement lacked accountability and focused more on self-preservation than genuine remorse. Her attempts to rebuild trust fell flat. Even after resigning from her job due to mounting pressure, she remained a polarizing figure. Some sympathized with her plight, arguing that she'd been publicly shamed beyond reason. Others saw her downfall as poetic justice, believing she'd brought it upon herself through her actions. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear. The incident had left an indelible mark on everyone who followed it. Back in the real world, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as possible after such a high-profile event. The man boarded another flight later that week, disappearing into the crowd once again. He didn't seek attention or validation. If anything, he seemed relieved to put the chaos behind him. As for the woman, she retreated from public view, grappling with the consequences of her choices. Though her name faded from trending lists, the lessons from the encounter lingered, reminding us all of the power of humility, the danger of assumptions, and the undeniable reach of social media in shaping modern narratives. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the airport incident continued to unfold, leaving lasting impressions on everyone who had witnessed or heard about it. For the man at the center of the story, life gradually returned to its usual rhythm, or as close to normal as possible after becoming an internet sensation. He went back to focusing on what mattered most, running his airline and ensuring passengers felt safe, respected, and valued during their travels. But even he couldn't escape the occasional reminder of that fateful day. One morning, while reviewing customer feedback reports in his office, he came across a comment from a recent traveler. "Thank you for creating such a welcoming environment. On your flights," the passenger wrote, "after everything I saw online recently, it's clear your company values kindness and understanding above all else." The note made him pause, not because it was surprising, but because it highlighted how deeply people craved positivity in a world often dominated by negativity. He smiled softly, jotting down ideas for ways to further promote inclusivity within his airline. For the woman, however, life had taken a much darker turn. Her public apology did little to quell the outrage directed at her, and the fallout from the viral incident proved relentless. She lost her job, her friends distanced themselves, and strangers continued to leave hateful comments on her now-deleted social media accounts. Some days she barely left her house, overwhelmed by shame and anxiety. Friends who reached out said she seemed like a shadow of her former self, withdrawn, defensive, and deeply regretful of the choices that led her here. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments of reflection. In quiet hours when no one was watching, she found herself replaying the events in her mind, dissecting every word she'd said and wondering where things had gone wrong. At first, she blamed the crowd, the cameras, and even the man himself for exposing her behavior. But over time, something shifted. She began to see the truth staring back at her, a truth she hadn't been ready to face before. Her actions weren't just a result of frustration or misunderstanding. They stemmed from biases she hadn't realized she carried. It was uncomfortable, painful even, but also necessary if she ever hoped to grow. Determined to make amends, she started attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, hoping to educate herself and prevent similar situations in the future. She joined community service programs, volunteering at local shelters and food banks to give back in small but meaningful ways. These efforts didn't erase her past mistakes, nor did they restore her reputation overnight, but they marked the beginning of a long journey toward redemption. Slowly, she began rebuilding trust, not with the world at large, but with herself. As for the wider audience captivated by the story, the incident sparked important conversations about privilege, prejudice, and accountability. On social media, debates raged on for weeks, with users sharing personal experiences of discrimination and offering advice on how to challenge harmful stereotypes. Educators incorporated the story into lesson plans, using it as a case study to teach students about empathy and critical thinking. Even late-night talk show hosts joked about the viral moment, turning it into a lighthearted yet thought-provoking segment about assumptions and humility. The airline industry took notice too. Inspired by the man's handling of the situation, other companies began emphasizing inclusivity in their operations. Flight attendants received additional training on conflict resolution, and airlines launched campaigns promoting respect and kindness among passengers. Travelers reported feeling more comfortable speaking up against discriminatory behavior, knowing that others might support them instead of staying silent. Months later, the man reflected on everything that had transpired. Sitting alone in his living room one evening, he scrolled through old news articles and memes about the incident. shaking his head at how quickly it had spiraled out of control. While some people hailed him as a hero, he never saw himself that way. To him, the real heroes were those who used the story as a catalyst for change, whether by starting difficult conversations, challenging their own biases, or simply treating others with more compassion. He also recognized the role luck played in the outcome. Had he not been the founder of the airline, the confrontation might have ended very differently. That realization weighed heavily on him, prompting him to use his platform to advocate for marginalized voices. He partnered with organizations fighting racial injustice, donated funds to initiatives supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs, and encouraged his employees to speak openly about their experiences with bias. His goal wasn't fame or recognition, it was progress. Meanwhile, the woman's name eventually faded from headlines, replaced by new scandals and controversies. But her story lingered in the minds of those who followed it closely. For many, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and the importance of owning one's mistakes. Others viewed it as proof that growth is possible, even in the face of overwhelming criticism. Either way, it reminded everyone of the power of accountability and the potential for transformation when we choose to confront our flaws head-on. By the end of the year, both individuals had moved forward in their own ways. The man continued, expanding his airline, introducing innovative programs designed to foster connection and understanding among travelers. Passengers praised the warm atmosphere on board his planes, noting how crew members went above and beyond to ensure everyone felt welcome. As for the woman, she remained largely out of the spotlight, dedicating her time to volunteer work and quietly working to rebuild her life. Though scars from the experience would always remain, she emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the impact her words and actions could have. And so, the story came full circle. A collision of pride, prejudice, and perspective that ultimately changed lives far beyond the confines of an airport terminal. It was messy, raw, and imperfect, much like humanity itself. But in its messiness lay a powerful lesson. We are all capable of making mistakes, but we are also capable of learning from them. What matters most is how we choose to move forward, and whether we allow those lessons to shape us for the better.